So it says here in our coding bat problem, which is array1 maxEnd3, given an array of integers length 3. So we only have 3 elements in the array, which means we only have our total index count to be 2, because our index actually starts from 0 and works its way up till the length of the array. So we have 3 elements in the array, and of course we have 0, 1, 2 as our indexes. So figure out which is larger. So we're supposed to make a distinction between which is larger, and we're supposed to make this distinction between not all the elements, but the first or last element in the array. So it's either going to be nums of, if of course the name of the array is nums, then it's either going to be nums of 0, which is of course the 0th index, which of course references the first element in the array, or it's nums of nums sub nums.length minus 1, which actually takes us to our last element in the array. So it's either this or it's either that. So of course, we want to first have some kind of condition by which we may discern which value is larger, the first or the last element. And after we figure out what that value is, we'll set all the other elements in the array to be that value. So there really just seems to be 2 parts to this question. The first part is find out which value is larger, right? Which is of course between nums of 0 or nums of nums.length minus 1. So between these, which is larger? And what I'm thinking is I'm going to store this in an integer value. And so after I figure out which is larger, I will set all elements in the array to that value. And I'm thinking that I could either do it with a for loop or without. I think both are equally valid. So first I'm going to find out which value is larger. So of course, if I'm going to be assessing, now there are really 2 ways. I could either use a for loop to traverse the entire array and assess which one is larger, but I don't think that's needed. I think we can just reference. We know which element, or rather which index, which actually references the element. We know which element we want to look at. And so in this case, we can have, like I said before, an integer value called, let's see, I could have highest value, right? Highest value. I'll set that equal to 0 from now. And as we sort of, so I can say, well, okay, if nums is sub 0, and that is, of course, the first element in the array referenced by the 0th index, if that is greater than what we would call the last element in the array, which is nums.length minus 1, because, of course, the length of the array is actually 1 more than the number of indexes that we have in total, or you could conversely say that the number of indexes that we have in the array is 1 less than the length of the array itself. And so we can say nums0 is greater than nums.length minus 1. And then, of course, we can say, well, if that is the condition, if that is true, then we will set highest value essentially equal to the value that we find at that present index. So that would be equal to nums sub 0. Otherwise, we assume that nums of sub 0 was not in fact greater than nums.length minus 1. In that case, we'll essentially just set the highest value to be equal to the other value that we had, which was, of course, nums.length minus 1. So by now, I think we figured out which value is higher. And we can safely go on to the next part and say, okay, well, now that we've figured out the highest value, we're going to set all the elements in the array to that value. So there are really 2 ways to do this. Either you could say, okay, I'm going to essentially go through the array for nums.length, because there are only 3 elements in the array, and I want to populate the array with 3 of the highest values. So I'll go in the array itself, and what I'll do here is I'll say, okay, nums of I, and that of course references an index, which actually gradually increments by 1. And so each time we increment, we're actually looking at a different index, which is of course looking at a different element, and it's changing that element to the highest value. So it's going to do this 3 times because we do it nums.length times, or we do it enough such that I is less than nums.length, but we're actually doing it for the entire array. But as we do it, we're setting each and every element to that value. And so when we return the nums array now, it would have been changed to each and every value in the highest value. And so we do this, and you can see here that we have something that's not a statement in line 13. Oops, so we should actually be incrementing by 1 each time. And as we do that, we have another thing that's not a statement. Let's see, looks like we just completely repeated the second part of our for loop. And you'll see that we're getting all greens. Now, so you could just say, well, instead of doing this, you could just say, well, okay, nums of 0, which is, of course, the first element referenced by the 0th index, can be essentially equal to the highest value. And essentially you do this 3 times, right? You say, okay, now we're moving on to the next one, which is, of course, the first element, which, well, it's the first index, which references the second element in the array, which is going to be called the highest value. And we can do nums of, let's say, 2 in this case, and this would be the last element in the array. And so I think it's wise to see here that you actually have 3 elements in the array, but you have the number of indexes in total is 1 less than the number of elements itself, which is, of course, the length of the array. And so here, highest value, we can set that to highest value as well. And so we've taken an array of 3 elements, and we've essentially populated these indexes, which of course are usually depicted under the elements themselves. And we've set highest value, we've taken highest value, and that of course was figured out in our previous section. And we've essentially taken this highest value and we've populated it. And so we've populated each and every element in the array with that highest value. And so after we press return, you'll see that we still get all greens, and so we're completely fine in that regard.